The human body can seem incredibly fragile, but the truth is that paired with our powerful drive to survive and amazing bonds with our loved ones, the human condition isn't all that powerless. People have found ways to overcome some of the most precarious situations imaginable. Want to hear a tale of a man who came back from the dead not only once but twice? Well then, check out these most harrowing stories of survival and endurance. At the height of the Cold War in 1960, Soviet submariners were running a training exercise in which they shot torpedoes at designated undersea targets. It was supposed to be a routine day on the Soviet Project 613 submarine, a Whiskey-class vessel that held a crew of 14. The first missile the young man prepared to deploy was a dud that didn't leave the blast tube. The crew moved on to the next step in their mission, unaware something was wrong until the failed missile exploded, piercing the body of the submarine and sending the vessel to the ocean floor. The men knew they had to escape, and the chain of command broke down in panic until one of the crew grabbed a gun and started shooting warning shots to force everyone to calm down. It was decided the entire crew would exit the submarine's empty torpedo tube. In order to do so, the team needed to slowly acclimate to the water pressure outside the ship, letting in water until their bodies were as pressurized as the outside environment. The men ascended to the surface, trying to take their time and use their equipment to let their bodies adjust. Some, however, continued to behave in agitation, ascending too quickly. This led to collapsed lungs and the need to recover in compression chambers. However, it is believed that every crew member survived. Juliane Kopka's Amazonian stay. Juliane, a young German girl living in Peru with her zoologist parents, was traveling with her mother to see her father in a different part of the country. While in the air, the plane was hit by lightning during a severe thunderstorm. The plane imploded, and Juliane fell from the sky while still trapped in her seat. She crashed some 2 miles to Earth, landing in the Amazon rainforest. She suffered a broken collarbone as well as a loss of half her vision, but was able to walk and investigate her surroundings. It immediately became clear that Juliane was alone and the only survivor of the flight. Juliane was a truly amazing child, knowing that if she found running water and followed it downstream, she'd be likely to find civilization. She did this for 9 days, during which she couldn't get sleep due to pain from the bugs that infested her injuries. Juliane eventually found a small boat with gasoline in it for its engine. Remembering when her father cured an animal of maggots with gasoline, the 17-year-old girl doused one of her arms and counted as 35 of the creepy crawlers came out of her skin. The owners of the boat found Juliane and took her on the 7-hour trip down the river to a place where she could be airlifted to a hospital. Despite what she called terrible nightmares, Juliane later wrote a story about her experience entitled, "When I Fell from the Sky." A harrowing World War II escape. Witold Glinski, a World War II Polish war veteran, along with a handful of other prisoners, escaped from a Russian gulag in February of 1941. The group first had to make it through the frozen landscape of a Siberian winter, then through the heat of the Gobi Desert before ascending the Himalayas. According to Glinski, the group sucked frost and dew off the stones in the morning to stay hydrated and relied on primitive fishing and hunting as they traveled. The men made it to British-held India when they finally found themselves saved. Glinski waited 60 years to rehash his story, saying that he didn't want to relive the trauma and that he feared another of the escapees who had been placed in the gulag for committing a serious crime. Glinski believed his reports, held in the Polish archives, inspired the story behind the best-selling book, The Long Walk. Andes plane crash survivors. In 1972, a small charter plane carrying a rugby team of 45 players and the team's staff went down in the Andes Mountains while on the way to a match in Chile. It was cold and snowy, which slowed down rescue efforts. 19 people perished from either the crash and the avalanche that followed the crash, which left the survivors without food or shelter. Luckily, many of the survivors were healthy and athletic young men who were determined to survive, despite their belief that no one was looking for them. All in all, the 16 young men left alive were stranded in the snow and ice, as well as braving frequent snowstorms and avalanches, and survived this terrible peril for 72 days. In 2012, the survivors held a rugby match, the same one they were headed to when their plane crashed, to mark the 40th anniversary of their rescue from the treacherous mountaintops. The man who came back from the dead twice. Beck Weathers was part of what many have called the Mount Everest disaster. A Texas native, he had already climbed Vinson Massif in Antarctica, and Everest was to be his second climbing experience. However, during the group's slow ascent up the mountain, oxygen levels plummeted unexpectedly. The group's trek was scheduled to take between 12 and 13 hours. Weathers was stranded on the side of the mountain and waiting to meet up with the rest of his expedition. But after seeing 10 hours go by without a sign of them, he knew something wasn't right. What he couldn't know at the time was that the expedition leader and guide, Rob Hall, became incapacitated at the summit and actually perished near the south summit. The rest of his team descended the mountain and discovered Weathers, who had become too ill from exposure to continue with the group, and reluctantly, the group thought he was doomed and left him there. It wasn't long after that a doctor found Weathers, who had lost a glove and slept the previous night with his jacket open. The doctor also decided that Weathers was beyond saving and thought he had already passed away. However, despite the mathematical improbability of his situation, Mr. Weathers surprisingly woke from his hypothermic coma, stood up, and walked down the mountain until he found a low-level camp and survived. However, he lost several limbs as well as his nose to frostbite. A 4-year-old's battle with nuclear disaster. Yuri Litvinov was only 4 years old when fires started in the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl, April 26, 1986, which led to an explosion. Yuri and his family lived about 2 hours' drive away from the site of the nuclear power plant. He recalls that his mother didn't explain what had happened, but quickly moved the family farther away from the plant to her parents' home. It took Yuri 3 years to see the first signs that something was not right, even living far away from the disaster site. He remembers that it would rain and the leaves on the trees would turn white, bleached from the radiation, before the trees themselves disintegrated. Suddenly, people around Yuri began to develop a cancer, a common ailment after experiencing radiation exposure, and Yuri himself was diagnosed with cancer when he was 21 years old. Yuri battled his deadly disease and won while turning to painting as therapy. After a struggle for life, Yuri moved to the USA with a strong desire to start a new life, one without illness, pain, or suffering. In 2010, Yuri moved to New York, where he continued his artistic career. The sinking of Jackson 4. Harrison O'Keefe was hired as a chef on the ship Jackson 4, which was a fishing schooner. On one of its regular trips out to sea, the boat was rocked by huge waves, and it capsized and sank, sending some members of the crew into the ocean. Harrison, however, was in the bathroom at the time the ship sank. He ended up trapped in a 4-foot-long bubble of air, which slowly shrunk as the ship went under the normally fatal depths. A dive team was put together after the Jackson 4's sinking to retrieve any goods in the area. As the divers were searching the ship, they heard faint knocking. They searched for the source, eventually finding Harrison in water up to his shoulders. It had been over 60 hours since the ship sank. Rescued, Harrison had to spend 2 days in a decompression chamber. Experts have agreed that Mr. O'Keefe's survival is a miracle. Normally, divers only stay at that depth for 20-minute intervals, as the pressure on the body is simply too much to sustain for prolonged periods of time. But Harrison was able to successfully return to land and had sworn to never go out to sea again. Surviving in Rwanda. Jean-Louis Mazimpaka survived the Rwanda genocide by first seeking refuge in a church with his parents. When the militia showed up bent on extermination, Jean-Louis was one of the first people that organized a 4-line defense of the church, who resorted to throwing rocks at the attackers. Though they held out for days, the militia began using grenades to scatter the lines. Jean-Louis then hid in a cow barn and watched as the militia stole the herd, staying so still so as to not reveal his hiding spot. Afterward, when he was sure the militia had left the area, Louis decided his best bet at survival was to swim across Lake Kivu, a feat that took him 2 nights. Jean-Louis eventually immigrated to the UK and married another Rwandan survivor. A cage in the desert. In 1934, a schoolgirl by the name of June Robles was walking home from school when she was picked up by strangers. Shortly afterward, her father received a ransom note delivered by a boy at his place of employment. Following that, another note was delivered to June's grandfather, at which time search parties were formed to look for June. A final note was delivered to her uncle, and in this final note, the kidnappers threatened to take June's life if they didn't receive ransom money. When June's family came up with the cash, which was about $300,000 at today's current rate, the kidnappers told the family where to find June in the desert. When found, June was very much alive inside a metal cage with her leg tied to the bars and buried under the sand. She'd been locked up there for 19 days and only fed 3 to 4 times. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to indict anyone for the heinous crime, and no arrests were made following June's kidnapping. However, the young girl proved her toughness and requested to go back to the metal box to recover her report card she'd left behind because she wanted her mother to see it. She grew up to raise 4 children and lived well into her 80s. A young boy defies the Nazis. George Richfield's parents knew that their days of running to escape the encroaching Nazis was at an end. Therefore, they threw their son over a barbed wire fence and straight into the arms of a Catholic woman named Halinka, who was willing to hide him. George was 9 months old at the time. During his war-long stay with Halinka, Richfield remembers a time the Nazis conducted a search for hidden Jews on a Sunday at the church Halinka attended. She told him to act sick so that they wouldn't get close. It worked. Another time, a Nazi soldier was searching Halinka's apartment and stuck his knife in the blanket over the bed Richfield was hiding under. The knife penetrated the mattress and poked the boy in the chin, but didn't draw blood. Richfield knew better than to make any noise. Again, it worked, and the boy remained undiscovered. George Richfield survived the war, immigrated to the United States, and continued to send care packages to Halinka. Although in the Soviet takeover, she didn't seem to receive them. Richfield later joined the US military and raised a family, proving survival after tragedy is the greatest triumph.